During difficult weeks when I'm feeling especially alone and isolated and feeling unsure about whether I am known or seen or recognized or understood by anybody, I can always take comfort and solace in the Instagram algorithm, which knows me better than anybody else. This week I got an ad in my feed from this algorithm that knows me so very well, and the ad was promoting a revolutionary new device which billed itself as the most effective tool ever for promoting spiritual wellness, mental acuity, emotional balance, and an enduring sense of tranquility and peace. Right. The endorsements under the picture brag about the fact that this amazing invention requires no harmful chemicals, no painful or strenuous physical activity, and no invasive bodily procedures. Obviously, I needed to learn more. And so when I clicked through to follow the link to this remarkable, life-changing device, I saw a photograph that I'll try to describe for you. The base of this device is a disc of wood, which I am assured is responsibly harvested from renewable forests. On top of the base is a sphere of glass, about this big, which is lit from within by an entrancing glow of colored light. There's a long white cable that comes out of the back of that wooden base, which can be plugged into the electrical outlet in your wall to power the illumination element tucked cleverly inside, which means that this revolutionary generator of miraculous peace and tranquility is a lamp. It's a lamp. But the glowing reviews on the site which sells this lamp assure us that it really does promote emotional wellness and spiritual insight. And the way it works is like this. You plug in the lamp, and when the globe lights up, you breathe in. When the light gets dim, you breathe out. And then you repeat that as many times as you need to achieve enlightenment. Now, I am very strategically not going to tell you the name of this product, nor am I going to share with you its exorbitant price, except to tell you that I am very upset that I was not the guy who patented the idea of a lamp that reminds you to breathe. Now, I'm being a little bit intentionally glib about the magic lamp that reminds you to breathe, but the idea behind it, that we can open a doorway into spiritual growth by promoting deliberateness in our daily patterns, by slowing down to remain conscious and mindful, that is very seriously and very truly in line with the disciplines of Jewish spirituality. The practice of striving to remain constantly aware, ever conscious of what we are doing and why, that, I can agree, sits at the core of a spiritually engaged existence. Now, in our portion this week, we read about the dramatic culmination of the 10 plagues, about the Israelites' hurried preparation for history's first Passover. An end is finally coming to the centuries of our ancestors' servitude in Egypt. The portion begins with a familiar scene that is repeated again and again in these early chapters in the book of Exodus. Moses and his brother Aaron approach the presence of Pharaoh and reiterate their demand. Shlach et ami, let my people go. Once more, Pharaoh refuses, now for the last time, as God unleashes the final 3 plagues, a swarm of locusts, a flood of impenetrable darkness, and the most terrible of them all, the death of the firstborn throughout Egypt. Only then, after this unthinkable havoc is set loose upon Pharaoh and his empire, does he finally relent, his spirit crushed his pride obliterated, and at last the slaves walk free. The story of the 10 plagues is always one that invites hard conversation about the morality of justice, about the chosenness of the Jewish people, and about the character of God's ethics. Jewish thought has always preserved a measure of ambivalence and some discomfort about this story. It's woven into the text of the Passover Haggadah. It's grappled by the writings of the greatest Jewish philosophers and ethicists for centuries. The question remains, what is the right way for us to respond ethically to the suffering of the Egyptians under these plagues? Should we celebrate the fact that they suffered? Should we denounce their suffering? Should we shake our heads sadly but shrug and conclude that these were just regrettable but unavoidable examples of collateral damage in the campaign of Jewish liberation? Why did our freedom have to be brought about this way, through these terrible plagues? And why couldn't God have been satisfied with just 1 or 2, let alone all 10? The traditional answer to that question is that God knew that the full set of 10 was going to need to be necessary in order to get Pharaoh to let the people go. Pharaoh was so tyrannical, so firmly set in his ways, that even if blood or frogs would convince him to soften his policies temporarily, he'd quickly revert back to his old ways and press the Israelites back into servitude once more. And so the full complement, all 10 plagues, would be needed to once and for all convince Pharaoh to let them go. The problem with that argument, however, is that it appears clear in the text that the thing that finally broke Pharaoh's spirit isn't the cumulative effect of one plague after another in series. It's instead the massive, devastating power of the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, that finally eradicates his resistance and forces him to relent. And so, if that's true, if God knew that that would be true, why not just send that one plague? Why not begin and end with the slaying of the firstborn and avoid the terror and the destruction of the repeating plague after plague after plague that led up to it? Well, there's a clue earlier in the portion when God speaks to Moses and commands him to make that final trip to approach Pharaoh and ask him to set free the slaves. Go to Pharaoh, God says, so that you may retell your children and your children's children how I displayed my signs among the Egyptians, and so that you may know that I am the Lord. In other words, what's being described here is not a set of plagues designed to impress the Egyptians with God's power. This is not a set of plagues designed to change the Egyptians' minds. It's designed to change our minds. The plagues aren't for Egypt at all, but for us. The purpose of the plagues is to show us, once and for all, that God's presence suffuses all things, flowing through the world of nature and history, through the realms of power and influence. The story unfolds that way so that the Israelites will cultivate a new set of eyes, a new way of seeing the world, a new awareness of the holy transcendence that is woven throughout every fiber of reality. That's why the plagues came in a recurring series of traumatic impulses. If you'll forgive the comparison, it's like the slow flashes of that mindfulness lamp. With each slow pulse, each beat, a gentle nudging reminder to breathe in the Spirit and the promise of liberation. And it is really hard to walk through the world that way, to remain in full awareness of the holiness soaked through reality at each moment. That is a tall order indeed, to exist in the full bloom of expanded spiritual consciousness. I remember years ago reading about a psychology experiment that they did in Princeton in the 1960s during those years when mindfulness practice and meditation were first making their way into American culture and American consciousness. Here's how the experiment worked. The researchers convened two separate groups of people and hooked them up to devices that would measure their perspiration and their breathing, their heart rate and blood pressure. The first group was the control group. This is a group of everyday people sitting in a room doing nothing special. And the second group was a gathering of Buddhists, of masters in Zen meditation. For both groups, they sat in their rooms quietly, and in each room, a bell would be rung at regular intervals, every 30 seconds or so. And the participants' responses to the bell were measured by the equipment worn on their skin. For that first group, the group of control participants, their bodies registered a very strong response to the first chime of the bell, slightly lower response to the second bell, and then as the series continued, one after the other, one bell following the next, their physical responses diminished slightly each time, until eventually, after a long series of chimes, their bodies registered no response at all. They'd become completely habituated and anticipated the chime of each bell, so they didn't react at all. The bell continued to ring, but so far as their bodies were concerned, it might as well have not been ringing at all. They had become totally attuned to expect the sound. Second group, however, that group of Zen Buddhist masters, registered the maximum possible response, complete shock, amazement, and radical awareness every time the bell rang, whether it was the first time or the 20th. They never allowed themselves to become habituated or anticipate the chime of the bell. The spiritual discipline that they had cultivated over years placed them in a permanent state of spiritual awareness, experiencing the world always in a mode of what Heschel called radical amazement. Every moment filled ecstatically with the glow of spiritual awareness and delight. Most of us move through our days like that first group of subjects. We don't always see the wonder and amazement of the world around us. We know that the birds are singing, but we don't pay any attention. We know that the light of the sun is slowly and gradually giving way to darkness and the glimmer of the stars, but we stop noticing them. We too become habituated and numb, and it's as if those miracles have ceased to exist. What God yearns for from us, we learn from our portion, is to find a way of walking through a world ablaze with holiness, with eyes that are open, commanded to break through our complacency and dullness. If we want to find a way of resolving the ethical crisis of the story about the 10 plagues, and especially about the repeated refrain of one act of suffering and trauma after another, we'll never resolve them by relating to some sort of relief that the Egyptians suffered, those who had enslaved us for so long. Instead, we can resolve the ethical dilemma by remembering the biblical commandment to tell our children and our children's children. That's the way that the legacy of the plagues is redeemed, and it is us who redeem it. Just before our ancestors walked free from slavery, they make a commitment to keep the story alive, not as a record of God's revenge, but as a blessing, a positive memory of what God wants for us: freedom and awareness. Each one of the 10 plagues, as they repeat, provide a reminder that we will pledge to tell our children in future generations, in the words that we'll say every year around a Passover table, every Shabbat when we remember our liberation from servitude, and every time we tell this story. transforming the story of our servitude into a reminder of the gift God gives to us. In that beautiful reversal, we remember that the point of the plagues isn't Pharaoh's humiliation or the destruction of Egypt. The point is the redemption of Israel, the liberation of our bodies and our spirits and our ability to see. That reminder is always ours to access, pulsing brightly like the light of that lamp. Each year, each week, each time we sit with one another to promise to remember who we are, where we have come from, and what we resolve to see. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shalom.